seems to approach that without recourse to what we might call as a religious narrative. It's not, Athena created it, or Zeus created it. Zeus and all these other Greek gods, the pantheon, right, all the gods, are living in a world that's already been created, basically, right? Thales comes up with the concept of water. Everything is made out of water. Kind of an interesting argument, and it persuaded perhaps one generation of folks. But as we move along the next generation, that is how they seem to be just one age group after the other. And Anaximenes thinks, well, air is more rarefied than water, so actually air should be the arche. And by the way, they don't know that air is a combination of gases. That's all not, even close. Aristotle couldn't figure out how fish, they can't breathe air as far as Aristotle's concerned, because they're in water and there's no air in water. We, of course, know today that there's oxygen in the water, and the fish are using their gills to breathe oxygen. So oxygen is one of the key elements, right? And Aristotle had no clue about that aspect of it. But so air, Anaximenes, Anaximander took it a little bit further and said, well, really, it's the infinite. And they didn't like that, because that was a very weird concept in Greek thinking. They liked more finite kinds of concepts, apparently, from what I've read. So the infinite wasn't a good idea. Heraclitus is, by the way, the first three, if you look them up, they're all from the same general vicinity in Turkey. Heraclitus is from somewhere else. You can look them up if you're interested in all that. But Heraclitus, and I should mention too, Thales means water, as far as I know, in Greek, the word. If you look these words up, they basically mean what they are arguing for. Heraclitus is the glory of time. Hera, did I mention that at all already? No. Hera, where we get hours, the hour, from, is Hera is the goddess of time and order, Zeus's spouse. But if you're into that mythology stuff, right? And so the glory of time, and the interesting thing about Heraclitus' philosophy is the arche is fire as a metaphor for change, because everything just keeps on changing. There is no specific building block in his, except for that everything keeps changing. Everything flows for him. And Anaxagoras comes up with atom. Atom, we all use, right? There's the A, again, that means no. Tom means cuttable. You can't cut them up. It's the smallest particle, you can't make them smaller. And obviously, once we figured out how to do that, we should have changed their name to something else, because we're still using uncuttable things. By the way, they have quarks that make them up, and we can blow them up too, depending on which kinds of atoms they are. Pythagoras, pith, agora. Agora is the marketplace. Pith means to speak out. So Pythagoras had secrets. So it's kind of confusing how his name means speaking out in the marketplace. Because on the other hand, he had a secret, club, basically. That's pretty weird. But he thought number was the arche, basically mathematics, and one being, the interest. I mean, they have all kinds of interesting connections based on that. One doesn't have any shape at all. Two has, is a line, right? But it's no depth, right? Three, you suddenly have shape. So if you're going to apply these numbers to the nature of things, you get earth, air, fire, water, and increasing, number. He also invented the divided line, the idea that we have harmony. So if you take a string and you pluck it, you get a particular sound from it, and if you break it up into a mathematical sequence, you get harmony with it, and so on. By the way, the Greeks totally screwed up music. Sorry to... I learned this from Professor Cohen, the professor in my... gave us a lecture on this. And the theory is that the music you could listen to then, and I could play examples, sound like ragas, if you're familiar with them from India, you know, where there's 12 tones to every one of the notes that we have in our musical system. And you could hear that pretty much all over the world, the theory was. And you could still hear it from like Celts and things, you know, where it was on the perimeter of that area. But as the Greeks came up with this idea, and it seemed rational, they invented the kind of notes that eventually would be codified by Bach in his I forget, there's a book that Bach wrote that everybody, you know, started, you know, this kind of music. But it didn't finish it because there were still other people that had to argue over what kind of, you know, arrangement you should make for your guitar and so on. Galileo's father, Galileo, was involved in that, arguing over how the music should be tuned and everything. But in any case, once we get the Greek concept of music, everything becomes based on this kind of string divided theory, and you end up with very boring music compared to what they had before. And you can hear that when you listen to some contemporaries, they still use all the tones. It's very emotional. It really gets us. But there is an advantage to having the tones broken up the way Bach gave them to us, and that is you can have multiple instruments playing together. In fact, you can have 100 instruments all playing along with another 100 voices in the chorus, and they sound good together. Try doing that with a bunch of sitars. They're not going to work. And that's because you can arrange all kinds of complex harmonies because of the rules that you set. And it's just fascinating. So Pythagoras. We also have, of course, the Pythagorean theorem. Everyone knows, perhaps? Yes? By the way, the Meno is a dialogue that demonstrates the Pythagorean theorem. The neat thing is we now know that the Egyptians had the Pythagorean theorem, and Pythagoras stole it from them. You know, that's not even an issue. They needed it to build things like pyramids. You know. So that's, you know. So the Greeks didn't actually discover all this stuff themselves. They were travelers and found out stuff and brought it home, and for some reason that's about as far back as our history gave us, until of course we dig deeper and figure out all kinds of other things. I should mention too, you know, when we look at the writing systems, we know the picture glyphics, you know, of the Egyptians are in, you know, each of them are pictures of a particular object, and the object clearly then became like the first letter that then that picture became the letter for, right? So it became an alphabet of sorts, right? We also know that the cuneiform, the wedge, Babylonian texts and so on were also an alphabet and so on. But when we get into the Greek lettering system, okay. Uh-oh. Actually, I should. Why am I using such a primitive system? How's that? Is that big enough for you to see? This box? Yes? So if you can imagine it, some of the easiest ones would be O. I'm trying to say O, how does my mouth look? That's pretty obvious, right? Theta, try saying theta and see if you're not keeping your mouth in the same circle, but you're putting your tongue straight across. You see that? Pretty easy. Roughly, what we're looking at here, M. Say moo. Doesn't it feel like you have your lips in the shape of an M? I'm exaggerating a little, but I mean, you know, it seems to me, and I think this is, you know, what we have is Greek is the alphabet that represents the sounds of the letter. By the way, they stole that from the Phoenicians, so it's not like the Greeks really invented this either. But so the neat thing about this is that when the Greeks are using words, they can come up with concepts that then they can write that do not have to be objects that you can see. Whereas the Egyptian hieroglyphics, you're looking at an owl or an ibis or a frog, or and then you're thinking, aha, frog, that's F or whatever, right? You know, but you're still looking at a frog or an ibis. Whereas if you write words like love, what's the object that love looks like? Right? None. So if you think of it, the alphabet that gives us sounds instead of pictures of things gives us the opportunity to come up with abstract concepts that don't map onto a particular visible object. Notice in Chinese that they still have a very complex system that's based on pictograms that basically picture a particular object. And as I understand it, that's what the language is actually doing. And so we'll see that there's some problems associated with Asian language systems that are still typical of different places that use that as their basic communication system, which is very different from a alphabet-based language. By the way, the Hebrew is also alphabet, aleph, bet, right? If you study Hebrew, and Arabic is also aleph, bet, very similar. Salam, shalom, very, very amazingly similar languages, by the way. They're called Semitic, both of them. And by the way, if you're an anti-Semite, I don't think you can be an anti-Semite if you're a Palestinian, because you're a Semite. Does that make sense? You know, there is an odd thing, the diaspora, the Jewish people had to leave because the Romans kicked them out, so they went to other places. As a result, over time, if you're familiar with it, lots of people got really upset with Jewish people, and every once in a while decided it was time to kill them all. Sorry about that. Fortunately, some lived and so on. But basically, those people who hated Jewish people were called anti-Semites. Yes? Yes? Familiar with that? Still have that as a problem, right? Only recently, well, actually not that recently, the Ottomans basically almost took over Europe. Europe just hung on by a thread, really, at one point. But today we have lots of people that are migrating to Europe who are coming from other countries that are also Semites, and they're Arabs, and it's been a confusing thing because no one knows whether it's appropriate to refer to not liking them as also being anti-Semitic. Is that interesting? Perhaps. It's just a puzzle for me. Not solved. Not a solved puzzle, right? Because they're all Semites from that they speak those languages, right? So interesting, in my mind, at least. So this is already something that's happening in the Greek language. They're already using their Greek alphabet to write. Not sure exactly when they started writing. On these philosophers, we don't have any of their complete writings available, but if you go to these different sites, you'll notice that they have writings from them, passages and so on. But where did they come from? Not books that we have